Peppa and Mom were choosing products from the shelves. Soon they noticed a figure in a dark cloak. Sometimes ordinariness concealed something else. The faceless shopper suddenly turned his head. Smooth gray skin was covered with cracks from which black liquid dripped and red dots flickered. Peppa nudged Mom.
Look,
Instead of the frightening figure, an ordinary shopper smiled and took a can of beans. Peppa approached the exit and looked outside. The cloak of the faceless one flashed in the doorway as he walked away down the street. He had already gone outside. Peppa stepped out onto the square. Among the passers-by, suddenly several faceless ones froze motionless. Gray faces with cracks and red dots flickered in the crowd. The crowd concealed their faces, but they harbored a great secret. One faceless one slowly raised his tentacle-like hand and pointed at Peppa. For a moment, all the passers-by distorted their faces, their skin pale. Cracks filled with black liquid and red dots flared up. Terrified, Peppa spun around and ran into a narrow alleyway. Peppa ran through the tight alley, panicking as she looked back. Black liquid was dripping down the walls, sticking to her little shoes. The streetlights flickered, but there wasn't enough light. Peppa froze at the door. For a moment, everything was completely silent. Only her rapid breathing could be heard. At that very moment, a faceless one leapt out of a puddle. His mouth opened in an inhuman grimace, and tentacles lunged into attack.
They stepped out into the rain. But this rain was different. The world around them was empty. A street lamp hummed faintly. Each drop carried darkness within it. A black puddle, like ink, spilled into reality. George leaned over the puddle. Emily grabbed his shoulder, stopping him.
step back.
It seemed the puddle was fading. A false alarm, but in its reflection atop the raindrops, a black, hooded figure appeared. The group approached a bench. The rain intensified. The longer they stayed in the rain, the deeper the infection spread. A drop landed on Susie. Her hand turned blurry, translucent. Emily screamed, pulling it away. They vanished. Peppa noticed bubbles rising in the old well. Evie began to cry softly. Black liquid dripped from the corner of her mouth. She reached toward the well. Even the little one understood. Something was hiding there. From the puddles lining the path, tendrils slithered out, surrounding Susie and Emily. The darkness didn't just take, it held on. Peppa ran, shielding Evie with an umbrella. Emily broke free, but stumbled. Tendril grabbed her. Her scream echoed everywhere. In the glow of the street lamp stood the Dripper, massive, black droplets trailing down his cloak. He was the soul of this rain, he whispered. Peppa, holding Evie in her arms, approached him, the umbrella raised like a shield. The final question, is it worth fighting, escape, or become the rain? Evie smiled.
Evie was drawing. Peppa was sitting nearby. "You're drawing very beautifully," said Peppa. "I tried to be just like you," replied Evie. The picture featured Peppa, but her smile was not her own. The next morning, Peppa woke up. George was looking in the mirror. "What's wrong with you?" asked Peppa. "There's someone else there," George answered emptily. In the evening, Peppa looked into the mirror, but behind her, someone else was standing. It was Evie, but she was taller and scarier. That night, Peppa woke up from a strange rustling in the room. George was no longer there. She quietly approached the mirror and saw a figure emerging from its depths. Distorted, it was Evie. Her legs, arms, and neck were very long. "Did you think you could stop me?" she hissed. Peppa tried to run, but suddenly several hands stretched out from the mirror and grabbed her. At that moment, her parents woke up. They heard the noise and rushed into the nursery. When they entered, they saw hands almost completely pulling Peppa into the mirror. Suddenly, she found herself inside a mirror world where only darkness reigned. Mama Pig and Papa Pig tried to help, but Evie caught them too. Moments later, the parents were lying on the floor, very pale and thin.
Welcome to my world. Now you are just reflections. I will replace you all.
In the evening, Peppa went home, but the road veered off to the side. She saw familiar faces, Susie, Rebecca, Denny, and new ones, pale and motionless. In the center of the circle, a puddle of black liquid reflecting the sky, but distorted. They stood silently, waiting. Peppa slowly approached. Susie turned her head abruptly without blinking. Her eyes, empty sockets, a black drop at the corner of her mouth. All the children simultaneously turned their heads toward Peppa, synchronously, faces devoid of emotion. The puddle in the center of the circle pulsed, gentle ripples emanating from it. Peppa stepped back. The children reached their hands out at the same time, their fingers elongated, black liquid flowing from them. The children's mouths opened to an unnatural width, but silently. The puddle in the center suddenly stretched upward, forming a black tentacle reaching toward Peppa. Peppa ran. When she looked back, everything had disappeared. But it was worse. Numerous trails of black slime led in different directions. Some led to Peppa's gate. Someone left with her, or followed her. Midnight, Peppa sat on her bed, drawing a circle in her notebook. A shadow near the door began to change. It was the silhouette of one of the children from the circle. Beyond the door, the park. That very park. Children in a circle. She was among them, standing hand in hand with the others. If Peppa isn't with them, then who is in the circle? Her eyes became as empty as Susie's. She slowly smiled. Suddenly, a face, blurred, eye sockets empty, mouth twisted into a grin, black liquid dripping, darkness flooding everything. You are already standing in the circle. You just don't know it yet. A normal day, Peppa and George are playing with dolls. One of them was strange. Its head was slightly tilted to the side. Peppa carefully turned the broken doll. A thin crack appeared on the face of the porcelain doll. Sometimes a small crack is just a premonition of something terrible. The light in the room flickered for a second. At that moment, Evie in the crib flinched and fell silent. She was no longer breathing evenly. Black liquid was dripping from the crack in the doll. Peppa ran to the crib, but it was empty. The outlines of tiny fingers had disappeared, replaced by cold fingerprints. A trail of black liquid stretched from the crib to the dollhouse. Horrified, Peppa took George's hand and led him there. In the central room sat the puppeteer, a figure with a porcelain face, but with cracks running all over its body. In its hands was Evie, like a doll, her eyes closed, unmoving. The puppeteer lifted its head and slowly opened its eyes. They glowed red. It stroked Evie's cheek and said,
My new doll.
Peppa and George froze as if held by an invisible force. The dollhouse continues to play, even if the players are silent. Doll Evie spoke in a creepy voice.
You are next.
Daddy Pig, Peppa, and George decided to go for a walk by the pond. When they reached the bend, the path to the pond was blocked. A sign read, Passage closed. But nearby, there was another sign pointing toward the forest. Daddy Pig noticed a fallen signpost. He picked it up and said,
Probably this way.
A narrow trail led into a sparse forest. The further they went, the quieter everything around became. No wind, no birds, only footsteps. Suddenly, a duck appeared. Daddy Pig suggested following her as she might lead them to the pond. Peppa was wary of the duck's behavior. She seemed strange. The duck started moving chaotically, but no one except Peppa paid attention to it. It seemed like they were walking in circles. Same sign, same turn, but not the same place. George looked into a puddle and saw himself, but his reflection was going backwards. Finally, the pond, but it didn't ring with duck calls or splash like usual. It was waiting. The water was smooth, dark, unnaturally black. At first, one duck appeared, then two, Their eyes were red. Suddenly, the ducks grew into huge, toothy monsters and roared wildly as they swallowed George and Daddy Pig. Peppa stepped back, but she lost her footing and disappeared into the darkness of the ominous pond. She was falling, but not downwards, through images like through cracks in glass. Something was waiting for her below. Suddenly, all became normal again, but she didn't say a word. They returned home. Everything looked normal, almost. Peppa was standing at the window. She looked like Peppa, but only on the outside. Peppa and George spent the weekend at the country house. While their parents relaxed at home, they played in the garden.
George, let's go look for treasure.
They got carried away and dug too deep. Suddenly, they fell into some underground space. It resembled an underworld. Everything around exuded horror. Peppa and George walked along a dark corridor and emerged into a huge ritual hall. The room was lit by a red glow. Walls were draped with chains, bones and skeletons lay scattered around, and in the center stood a table.
George, look! This must be a sacrificial altar.
Peppa, I think we should leave.
George muttered nervously.
Yes, right now.
Peppa said as if she had an idea, but George was already pulling her by the hand toward the exit. Suddenly, they realized they couldn't escape on their own.
Are we stuck here forever?
Don't cry. We'll figure something out.
Peppa said, and started calling for help. Their cries brought their parents running. They were furious, but helped the piglets get out. On the way home, Peppa enthusiastically told them about the ritual hall. Her excitement frightened George. Their parents just exchanged glances and laughed. That night, Peppa said,
George, I have something special.
She pulled a small bone from under her pillow. It was glowing with a bright green light.
Peppa, you're going to get into trouble?
George warned anxiously, but Peppa didn't listen and happily played with her find. Suddenly, the floor in the nursery cracked open into two parts, and from it emerged a gigantic skeleton with red eyes, a terrible smile, black claws, and red tentacles behind its back.
You stole my bone. You will pay for this.
It said in a demonic voice. The skeleton grabbed Peppa's hand and lifted her toward the ceiling. Meanwhile, Dad and Mom Pig were sitting in the living room reading books. Suddenly, Evie ran into the room.
Bear! Where is my bear, Mommy?
Honey, he's probably lost again among your toys. Let's go find him.
Mommy Pig picked up Evie in her arms, and they headed to her room. When they opened the door, they froze in horror. Everything in the room was upside down. Walls were scratched with claws, and in the middle of the room hung Bear on a rope with black crosses instead of eyes.
My bear!
Sweetheart, it's just some evil joke.
Mom said nervously. Suddenly, they heard wild screams from Peppa's and George's nursery. The room was in chaos. George was hanging in a net in the upper corner of the room with white eyes as if hypnotized. Peppa was standing against the wall with black eyes and a creepy smile. She was whispering some spell and scratching something on the wall with a bone. Dad Pig was lying on the floor and barely managed to say, "Run!" In the center stood an ominous skeleton. It turned toward the door and whispered in that same chilling demonic voice.
Oh, we have guests. You're just in time. I just finished with these little pigs.
Peppa and George decided to take a walk in the forest and stumbled upon an old, abandoned house. It looked very gloomy. Broken windows, overgrown bushes, creaky door. Inside, it was dark and cold. Cracked portraits hung on the walls. Their eyes seemed alive. Suddenly, it became dark outside the window. At that moment, a strange woman appeared. The owner of the house. Her face was pale, and her eyes were cold and frightening. She smiled strangely and said,
Welcome. You shouldn't have come here.
Suddenly, she began to change. Her face distorted. Her eyes shone with bright red light, and something black flowed out of them. Peppa tried to run, but the door slammed shut by itself. The demon owner grabbed Peppa and George with her long claws. Their screams disappeared into the darkness. Everything around started to distort. The house's owner dragged the children into her dark basement. Peppa and George were tied up. Their mouths were covered with rags. The owner was boiling something murky in a huge cauldron and muttered,
Soon I will enjoy this.
Peppa turned around and saw Susie and Rebecca. They were also tied up and trembling with fear. Suddenly, a familiar, sinister whisper sounded. The door opened. Standing in the doorway was Evie, with tentacles and a sinister smile. She grabbed the house owner with one of her tentacles and swallowed her with a sinister sound. Afterward, Evie smiled sweetly but continued to radiate horror. The children were scared. They already knew what awaited them. Evie wasn't full yet and was planning to fix that. Peppa and George happily jumped in a muddy puddle. When they got home, Mama Pig asked Peppa to go to the attic for a jar of jam. The attic was dark and dusty. At the end of the room, Peppa saw a jar, but nearby stood a strange old lamp she had never seen before. Curious, she picked it up and took it to George. She eagerly rubbed it. Suddenly, the room filled with swirling mist, and a skeleton-like silhouette appeared before her, wearing a hat, boots, and holding a cane. Peppa and George were very frightened, but they realized it was a genie. Peppa made a wish for herself. The creature grinned eerily and said, "At your service." Meanwhile, Mama and Papa Pig were busy. Mama was making jam and Papa was working in his study. They had no idea what was happening in the nursery. Peppa wished that no one would ever tell her what to do and that she could do whatever she wanted. George, trembling, exclaimed, "Peppa, why are you making that wish?" Suddenly, the creature disappeared, and happy Peppa ran to tell her parents about her adventure. But when she entered the study, no one was there anymore. The kitchen was also empty. Mammy and Daddy Pig had vanished. Panic seized Peppa. She quickly ran back to the nursery to cancel her wish. When the creature reappeared, Peppa and George were horrified. Their parents, wrapped in thin tentacles, were trapped under the creature's ribs. It grinned eerily. Peppa demanded everything be undone, but the skeleton only smirked. "Silly piglet, now you are all in my power." Suddenly, their house found itself in another world where only darkness reigned. Now they were new residents of a creepy lamp. It all started like any other day. Daddy Pig was fixing a floorboard. Peppa, George, and Evie watched. Evie stared into the gap, silent, unmoving, eyes too wide.
Don't go down there.
Daddy Pig said.
Just dust and spiders.
That night, Peppa woke up. Strange lights flickered under her door. She heard soft rustling. At the end of the hall, she saw Evie.
Peppa, we're waiting.
In the living room, the rug was gone. In its place, a gaping hole. She stepped closer. Creak, crack. A hand grabbed her. She was pulled under the floor, into darkness, cold, whispering, laughter. Then a warped version of Evie's song. Peppa trembled. Evie stood before her, body twisted, taller, eyes hollow.
You came to play.
She whispered. Peppa backed away, touched something. She turned and saw Daddy Pig. His eyes were glowing. She ran. Hands reached out, faces flickered. Ahead was a light. It was the silhouette of Mummy Pig. She climbed toward the light, and suddenly a white flash. She gasped in bed. In her room, she looked around, panting. Everything looked normal. She exhaled, nervously smiled. But then she looked up. Evie was on the ceiling, smiling.